Lauren here with a teaching for you today that comes from the desert spirituality of the early Christian church, Judeo Christian spirituality. And this teaching is specifically from what we call the desert mothers or desert amas. These were women who held leadership roles in the early Christian church. Yes, women were deaconesses, they were priestess, they were funding even the early church movement, carrying forward the wisdom of Yeshua. But the desert mothers specifically were women who left the turmoil that was developing in the early church, the theological debates and the political intertwinings happening as the Christian church was evolving. They wanted to let go of that dogmatic tension building in the church to really just get into their devotional life and to know the true presence of God, the undefinable God. And so their their wisdom that they instilled through their practices, these were ascetic women who spent much of their time in solitude, simply in the presence of God. They were kind of renunciants. They were isolated somewhat. They also held mentorship and spiritual guidance for others because they actually were sought out as spiritual guides. And so their wisdom is still so relevant to our world because our world of overwhelm and overdoing really needs that wisdom of slowing down in order to align and even notice the presence of the divine in our lives so that we can be guided from that internal presence rather than always seeking external guidance and validation. And so this particular lesson is around detachment. And detachment allows for greater direct experience of the divine presence. To deepen into this divine presence, we have to free ourselves from distractions. And we all know this, but it's a constant refinement, a constant purification, releasing these distractions. And so this is why it is such an important piece of our devotional life is to detach, detach, detach. And so the detachments, or the distractions rather, they can kind of show up, in the overwhelm of our worldly burdens, the false self, which is full of worry or discontent, disappointment, unworthiness, maybe even longing or distorted desire, restlessness, anxiety, mistrust. Those are just a few examples. Detachment cultivates an inner freedom, which is vital to deepening our experience of God. So Laura Swan writes from her book, The Forgotten Desert Mothers, about this desert spirituality. And she says that as we deepen into this like interior freedom, the aspects of our false self are removed and a clear understanding of our true self emerges. Don't we all long for that? Isn't this like not only a life of returning home, like to our creator, or to that original point of creation where the soul um, belongs to, but even like this returning home to ourselves. I think sometimes we spend our entire lives seeking the truth of who we are. And there's this sort of disconnect or this disenchantment when we're not authentically in the truth of who we are. And so there's this healing that needs to happen, and we begin by detaching from the false self. And that instills kind of this quality of this interior freedom that she writes about. She also says that it is the true self that dwells deeply with God. I feel like that statement is really convicting because when we're operating out of the egoic system or our false self, we tend to kind of navigate through life on our own terms. And when we do that, we sort of push God over here because God's presence forces us to meet ourselves as we're showing up. And so God invites us to really face our false self and acknowledge the aspects of our false self that we need to release and detach from. And that can be really challenging. We're very attached to the ego, to the false self, to these um, aspects of ourselves, the behaviors, the even like the emotions. Even the emotions, we can be very attached to our emotional body, attached to our woundings, our identities, our shortcomings. Even we're attached to those because they provide quality of familiarity and comfort, and we don't want anyone to mess with that. However, in the abundant simplicity of our true self, we experience deepest joy. So she writes about the true self having this quality of simplicity, and in not a simplicity um, of lack or having to have less, but there's this abundant simplicity. In the abundant simplicity of our true self, we experience deepest joy. And so here's the invitation for us to notice the quality of joy in our lives and where this joy derives from. Does our joy come from like maybe times where we can pat ourselves on the back because somebody acknowledged, like something that we accomplished? And not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But that's a different quality of joy, because if our accomplishment came from bypassing our true self, it gets very complicated. That's a complex way of operating in life, and it's not always authentic. There was um, a, a metaphor and a term or a phrase that I used in a class recently that struck someone, and it kind of struck me too. And we were working with the flower moon, which was recently the full moon, and so we were working with the idea of the flower and using the flower as a symbol of our own blossoming in life. And what came through is that the flower doesn't go through its life process needing to be anything other than what it is. It simply allows itself to unfurl, to to be fragrant, to be in God's design exactly as it was created. And I think that's so different than our human tendency to want to be something different than we are. So we have all these layers of the false self that we wear. What would it be like to be in the joy of being that beautiful flower, just relishing in its creation? What would it be like to unload the burden that we carry, to let go of the complexity of trying to create ourselves to be something that maybe we're just not? So, to summarize, our joy comes from the simplicity of our true self, which we find through that interior freedom, which requires detachment. So, in your devotional leadership, make sure that you have this continual refinement of detachment. When we feel some constriction in life, when we're feeling challenged, when we're feeling unclear, we might need to take a look at what we need to detach from, to allow a greater connection of the divine to be revealed. Because the divine is always there, but it's that false self that creates the separation or that unnearness. And so when we drop down those falsities, oh, there's the divine. And then we lean into the guidance. We allow God to reveal maybe our truer nature. We allow the abundance of simplicity that comes from that true nature. And that is what leads to joy in all the things that we do. With that, let's drop our eyes down for a little stazio or sacred pause. Maybe taking 3 nice, long, slow breaths. Softening the mental body, the heart, the physical body, so that you can let go of what was and step into what is next in the fullness of your own presence, bringing your presence to the next task, the next interaction or conversation or action. And peace be with you.